Meeting the girl sparks questions, long-lost memories and a forbidden hope. She doesn't remember who she is, but her heart recognizes the one she loved before she even learned to talk. What was once loss becomes a reunion, and the truth shatters a silence that time could never erase. If you're intrigued by this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The heavy Sunday afternoon air hung over Greenwood Cemetery when Richard parked the luxury sedan near the main gate. At 42, he wore his navy blue suit even on weekends, as if the clothes were armor against the world. Beside him, Beatrice adjusted the silk scarf covering part of her brown hair and took a deep breath before opening the door. This visit to the family mausoleum happened every second Sunday of the month, a ritual they had kept for 8 years without fail. The couple walked in silence along the marble pathways, passing tombs covered in fresh flowers and others, abandoned to time. Richard carried a bouquet of white lilies, Beatrice's favorite flowers. She held a small rag doll she had bought the week before, replacing the one that time and humidity had destroyed. It was always like this: flowers for the memory, toys for the pain that never healed. They stood for long minutes before the light marble mausoleum. The discreet plaque bore only a name and dates that marked a life that had barely begun. Richard placed the flowers in the bronze vase, while Beatrice arranged the doll next to the others already there, forming a colorful row of remembrances. Neither of them cried during these visits anymore. The tears had run out in the first few years, replaced by a constant emptiness that inhabited their chests. When they finally turned to leave, the afternoon sun cast long shadows among the cypress trees. It was then that Beatrice stopped abruptly, her hand gripping her husband's arm with unexpected force. Richard followed her gaze and felt the air leave his lungs. Near the gate, a girl of about 7 was holding the hand of a woman in a blue janitor's uniform. The child was looking directly at them, and there was something about her face that made Beatrice's heart pound painfully. It wasn't just the physical resemblance that disturbed her, though the straight brown hair, almond-shaped eyes, and delicate facial structure were frighteningly familiar. It was the way the girl tilted her head slightly when observing something that caught her attention, exactly as Beatrice had done since she was a child. And there was more. On the girl's neck, hanging from a thin, slightly rusted chain, dangled a butterfly-shaped pendant with blue and yellow enameled wings. Beatrice brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a sound that could have been a gasp or an exclamation. Richard held her by the arm, feeling his wife's body tremble. That necklace, he knew every detail. He had bought it himself at a jewelry store downtown, just a few months before the fire that destroyed part of their mansion and changed their lives forever. It was a one-of-a-kind piece custom-made, with initials engraved on the back of the butterfly. The woman in the uniform began to pull the girl in the opposite direction, but the child resisted for a few seconds, keeping her eyes fixed on Beatrice. There was curiosity in that childish gaze, but also something deeper, as if she were trying to remember something important she had forgotten. Then, finally, she turned and followed the woman, disappearing among the trees that lined the cemetery. Richard practically had to carry Beatrice to the car. She was shaking so much her legs could barely support her. Inside the vehicle, they sat in silence for several minutes before she could speak, and when she did, her voice came out hoarse and broken. "Did you see? Did you see the necklace, Richard?" He nodded, his hands still gripping the steering wheel without starting the engine. He had seen that necklace in his nightmares for 8 years. It had been found in the fire-damaged room, blackened by smoke, along with the remains of the crib and tiny clothes. The investigators said it was common for metal objects to survive intense heat. The necklace had been stored in a velvet box inside Richard's safe, along with other memories he didn't have the courage to look at. But now it was there, on that little girl's neck. "It could be a coincidence," he said, but his own voice betrayed his lack of conviction. "Maybe it's a similar necklace." Beatrice turned to him, and Richard saw an intensity in his wife's eyes he hadn't seen in years. That dull, distant look she had carried since the tragedy had been replaced by something fierce and desperate. It wasn't similar, it was identical. And that girl, her voice broke. "Richard, She had my way of looking at things, the shape of her face, the dimple in her chin when she smiles. Richard wanted to argue, to say that the pain was making Beatrice see things that weren't there. But he had noticed it too. More than that, he had felt a tightness in his chest so violent upon looking at that child that he had to restrain himself from running after her and asking her name, where she came from, who her parents were. They drove back home in silence. The mansion on the Upper East Side greeted them with its empty grandeur. 42 rooms, perfectly manicured gardens, and a silence that echoed through the halls. Richard had turned the place into a mausoleum after the fire. The destroyed room remained locked, untouched. That night, Beatrice couldn't sleep. Richard found her in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, sitting with a cup of cold tea. She was staring into space. "I have to find her." "Beatrice, don't ask me to forget what I saw. Don't ask me to pretend it was my imagination." She finally looked at him, tears streaming down her face. 8 years, Richard. 8 years believing our daughter was dead. What if there was a mistake? What if something happened that we don't know about? Richard pulled up a chair and took her cold hands. For years, he had forced himself to be strong, to remain rational. He had built a business empire using work as an escape, filling every minute with meetings, trips, negotiations, anything not to think. But now, looking at Beatrice, he realized he might have only postponed a pain he had never processed. "Tomorrow we'll go back there," he said, surprising himself with the decision. "We'll look for that woman, we'll find out who that girl is." Beatrice squeezed his hands tightly, as if clinging to a life raft in the middle of a shipwreck. And maybe that's exactly what it was. After 8 years adrift in a sea of grief and absence, there was finally something to hold on to, even if it was just a remote possibility, a hope too fragile to be spoken aloud. But it was enough to make them breathe again. The next morning they arrived at the cemetery as soon as the gates opened. They walked among the tombs, searching for any sign of the woman in the blue uniform or the girl. They asked the groundskeeper, the florists, the security guards. No one knew who they were talking about. The cemetery received hundreds of visitors on weekends. They were about to give up when Beatrice noticed a small chapel where services were held. The door was ajar, and from inside came the sounds of someone cleaning. Beatrice pushed the door open slowly, and there she was, the woman in the blue uniform, on her knees, scrubbing the floor. The woman looked up and tensed. She stood, tossing the rag into the bucket. She must have been about 35, her face marked by hard work. But her eyes were kind, and there was a resignation in them, as if she had been expecting this moment. "You're looking for the girl," she said. It wasn't a question. Beatrice took a step forward, trying to control the urgency that threatened to spill from her voice. "Please, we need to talk to you. It's about the necklace she was wearing yesterday." The woman wiped her hands on her stained apron. She glanced around, checking if they were alone in the chapel, then motioned for them to come closer. Her shoulders slumped slightly, as if she were carrying a weight she could finally share. "My name is Maria," she said quietly. "I've been cleaning the church here for 5 years. Before that..." She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Before that, I used to work as a housekeeper." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something in the way she spoke, the way she avoided looking directly at them, that stirred confusing memories in his mind. Maria continued, the words coming out with difficulty. "Laura has lived with me since she was very little. My older sister Stella brought her to me one day. She said I needed to take care of the girl, that there was danger, that she couldn't explain right then, but that one day I would understand." Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "That was almost 8 years ago." Beatrice had to lean on one of the chapel pews. Her legs were trembling so much they threatened to give way. Richard put his arm around his wife's shoulders, but he himself felt the world spinning around him. 8 years, the same time as the fire. "Your sister?" Richard's voice came out harsher than he intended. "Where is she now? We need to talk to her." Maria shook her head. "Stella disappeared 3 months later. She left a note saying she had to vanish. I tried to look for her, but I never saw her again." She paused. "I recognized you yesterday, Stella. Worked as a nanny at your mansion on the Upper East Side. The silence that followed Maria's revelation seemed to suck all the air out of the chapel. Beatrice gripped the back of the pew so tightly her knuckles turned white. Richard felt his legs weaken, but forced himself to maintain his composure. Stella. The nanny who had disappeared shortly after the fire, the young, dedicated woman who had cared for their daughter with such affection and who, according to the report at the time, had fled without explanation. Stella never told me everything, Maria continued, her voice trembling. She just said that Laura needed to be hidden, that there were dangerous people involved. I was young, only 27, and she was my only family. I trusted her. I raised Laura as if she were my own daughter. Richard approached slowly, trying to control the avalanche of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. The necklace the girl was wearing yesterday. Where did it come from? Maria bit her lip, hesitant. It was with her when Stella brought her to me. It was the only thing she had besides the clothes on her back. Stella said to never take it off, that it was important. I didn't know what it meant, but I respected her wishes. Beatrice let out a sob she had been trying to contain. Richard held her, feeling his wife's body shake against his. For 8 years, they had believed that necklace was stored in their safe, but what was there was just the burnt chain without the pendant. Richard had always assumed the butterfly had melted in the fire, but no, it was with Laura. We need to do a DNA test. The words left Richard's mouth before he could think. Please, we need to be sure. Maria backed away, her eyes wide with fear. No, you're not taking her from me. I raised her. I'm the only mother she knows. Nobody is going to take anyone from anyone, Beatrice said, her voice choked but firm. We just want to know the truth. If she is our daughter, we have the right to know, and she has the right to know who she is. Maria agreed to the test, but set conditions. A neutral doctor, a guarantee that Laura wouldn't be taken from her. Richard hired discreet professionals. Laura went to the doctor's office on a rainy Tuesday. Beatrice saw the girl up close for the second time. The child was shy but curious. She had the same ear shape as Beatrice, the same jawline. When she smiled, the dimple appeared in her chin. The doctor collected saliva samples. The results would take a week. Richard tried to focus on work, but it was useless. His secretary, Jennifer, noticed the change. Beatrice began to watch Maria and Laura from a distance. She saw them go to school, to the grocery store, when they returned to their apartment in Astoria, Queens. Laura wore a patched but clean uniform, living a simple life but one cared for with love. During one observation, Beatrice saw something that made her stop breathing. Laura was playing alone during recess, drawing in the sand. When another girl knocked over her drawing, Laura didn't cry. She just looked up with that characteristic head tilt, smiled, and started drawing again. It was exactly what Beatrice used to do as a child. On the 5th day, the lab called. There had been contamination in the samples. They would need to collect them again. It's on purpose. Someone is sabotaging this, Beatrice panicked. Richard used another lab, one owned by an old friend. Another week of waiting. During that week, strange things began to happen. Richard came home to find the door to the locked room ajar, the fire-damaged room. He had the only key in his safe, but the door was open. He entered slowly, his heart racing. The room was exactly as he had left it 8 years ago. Blackened walls, charred remains of furniture, the acrid smell of smoke that had never completely faded. But there was something new. In the center of what was left of the crib, someone had placed a photograph. It was a photo from the day of the birth. Beatrice in the hospital, holding a baby wrapped in a light blue blanket. Richard beside her, smiling with pride. But the photo was torn in half. It only showed half the scene. Richard picked up the photograph with trembling hands. Who had been in here? How? He called Beatrice. She turned pale when she saw the image. I had that photo in my picture frame in the bedroom. It was there this morning. I'm sure of it. They checked the security cameras. Nothing, no record of a break-in, no strange movements. Just the regular staff. The cook, Rosa, who had worked with them for 20 years, and the gardener, Tom, who had been with them just as long. Someone inside the house is doing this, Beatrice whispered, grabbing Richard's arm. Someone who doesn't want the truth to come out. The next morning, Maria called. Her voice was tense, frightened. "We need to talk. In person. Now." They met at a quiet coffee shop, far from both the mansion and Maria's apartment. She arrived without Laura, her eyes red from a sleepless night. "I got a call last night," she said, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "A man, a voice I didn't recognize. He told me to stop with the tests, said if I continued I would regret it." Richard felt his blood run cold. "Threats? You need to go to the police." "I can't. He said if I went to the authorities, Laura would suffer the consequences. That he knew where she went to school, where she walked, what time she got out." Maria started to cry. "I'm scared. So scared. But I also want the truth to come out. Laura deserves to know who she is. But not at the cost of her safety." Beatrice reached out and held Maria's hand. For the first time, the two women connected not as adversaries fighting over a child, but as two people who loved the same girl and wanted to protect her. "We'll hire security," Richard decided. "Discreet but effective. For you, for Laura, for us. Whoever is doing this isn't going to win." But the situation only got worse. 2 days later, Beatrice was leaving a doctor's appointment when she noticed a black sedan following her. She tried to lose it, changing her route, but the vehicle persisted. Finally, at a traffic light, a man in a suit got out and knocked on her window. She almost screamed, but the man just handed her an envelope and returned to his car, which sped off immediately. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. On it, a typed message. "The past should stay buried, for everyone's sake." Beatrice took the envelope to Richard. He held it up to the light, looking for any clue, any mark. Nothing. Plain paper, laser printing, no apparent fingerprints. "Someone knows about the tests," Richard murmured. "Someone with a lot to lose if the truth comes out." It was then that he started to think, who would benefit if his daughter were truly dead? Who had access to the mansion that night? Who disappeared right after the fire? The list was short but disturbing. That night, Richard opened his safe and took out all the documents related to the fire. Fire department reports, investigations, testimonies. He read everything again, line by line, looking for something he might have missed 8 years ago when he was too devastated to question the official conclusions. And he found it. A small inconsistency. The report said the fire started in the baby's room, caused by a short circuit in a lamp. But Richard remembered clearly. That night, the lamp wasn't on. He had checked it himself before leaving for a business dinner. Beatrice was with him. The room was dark, with only the light from the hallway faintly illuminating it. If the lamp wasn't on, how could it have caused a short circuit? Richard felt the floor disappear from under his feet. For 8 years, he had believed it was an accident. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had deliberately started that fire? The next day, the results of the second test arrived. Dr. Paulson called Richard personally. His voice was strange, a mix of shock and disbelief. "Richard, you need to come in person. There's something you need to see." When Richard and Beatrice arrived at the office, Paulson led them to his private study. He closed the door, drew the curtains, and placed the envelope with the results on the desk. "I ran the test 3 times, he said. "I couldn't believe the results, but it's unequivocal." He paused, looking directly into Richard's eyes. "Laura is biologically your daughter. No margin for doubt. But there's more." "More?" Beatrice whispered. Paulson opened another report. "I searched the databases for any related birth records, and I found something disturbing. On the day your daughter was born, there was another registration at the same hospital. Another baby girl born in the same maternity ward around the same time, but that child was registered as stillborn." Richard frowned. "And what does that have to do with us?" Paulson took a deep breath. "Because that baby had physical characteristics identical to those described in your daughter's registration, and because, according to the files, she was buried 3 days after the fire at your house, in the same cemetery you visit every month." The silence that filled the office was absolute. Beatrice pressed a hand to her chest. feeling her heart pound so violently she feared it would stop. Richard gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. "Are you saying," Richard's voice came out hoarse, "that another child was buried in our daughter's place?" Paulson nodded gravely. "It's the only explanation that makes sense. The hospital records from that day are a mess, with several alterations made later. It looks like there was a deliberate swap. Your daughter was declared dead in the fire, but she was actually alive, and another baby, who had really passed away, was used to support that lie." Beatrice began to tremble. For 8 years, she had visited a grave that did not contain her daughter. She had cried, left flowers, talked to a headstone that hid the cruelest truth. And somewhere, someone knew this. Someone had orchestrated it all. "We need to find out who had access to the hospital records," Richard said, his voice now filled with a cold determination. "Who was working that night? Who could have made those changes?" Paulson hesitated. "Richard, this involves serious crimes, forgery of documents, concealment. You need to think carefully before you stir this up. It could be dangerous." "My daughter was stolen from me," Richard replied, each word as heavy as lead. "And I will find out who did this, even if it takes the rest of my life." In the following weeks, Richard hired a private investigator, Michael Sullivan, a respected ex-cop who had retired after uncovering corruption in the force. The first breakthrough came quickly. Only 3 people had access to alter documents at the hospital: the director, Dr. Sylvia Clark, the coordinator, Anthony Fisher, and the administrative assistant, Brian Miller. Michael investigated all 3. Dr. Clark had retired and was living in Florida. Anthony still worked at the hospital, with no irregularities on his record. But Brian Miller was different. He had resigned 3 months after the fire, disappeared for 2 years. When he returned, he bought an apartment in an upscale neighborhood, started a company that grew rapidly and traveled abroad. "It's him," Richard murmured. "It has to be him." Michael was cautious. "Prosperity isn't proof of a crime. We need evidence." The opportunity came unexpectedly. Maria received a call from an unknown number, a nervous female voice. "You don't know me," the woman said, "but I need to talk about Stella, your sister. I know what happened to her." Maria almost dropped the phone. "Who are you? Where is Stella?" "I can't talk on the phone. Meet me tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon in Union Square. I'll be on the bench near the fountain, wearing a red scarf. Come alone." Maria told Richard and Beatrice. They decided Michael would go undercover, keeping his distance. The next day, Maria arrived at the square early. At 2 o'clock sharp, a thin, pale woman sat on the bench wearing a red scarf. Maria approached. The woman started to cry. "You look so much like Stella." "Who are you?" "My name is Renee. I was working at the hospital the night of the fire. I was a nurse in the maternity ward." Renee looked around nervously. "Stella called me 2 weeks before she disappeared. She was terrified. She said she had discovered something terrible and needed to protect the baby she was caring for. She begged me to help her." "And did you help?" Renee nodded, wiping away tears. "I gave her information about hospital procedures, shift change times, when it would be easiest to leave without being seen. But she never told me exactly what she had discovered, only that it involved powerful and dangerous people." Maria felt a chill. "Do you know where she is now?" Renee's face contorted in pain. "Stella called me one last time, 3 months later. She said she was safe, but that she couldn't come back. That if she did, she would put the baby in danger. She made me promise never to tell anyone, but—" Her voice failed. "I can't carry this weight anymore, not after what I saw." "What did you see?" Renee took a deep breath. "A week ago, I went to visit my mother in a private hospital, and I saw him there. Brian Miller, the man who worked in the hospital administration when it all happened. He was talking to someone, and I overheard part of the conversation. They were talking about making sure the past stayed buried, about eliminating any remaining evidence. And then he mentioned Stella's name." Maria grabbed the woman's arm. "Do you know where Stella is? Please, I need to know." Renee took a piece of paper from her pocket. "She gave me an emergency address, said to use it only if something serious happened." The address was for a small town upstate, 4 hours from the city. Richard and Beatrice wanted to go immediately, but Michael dissuaded them. If she's been hiding for 8 years, it's out of fear. If you show up suddenly, she might run again. Let me make contact first. It was difficult to wait. Michael called late that afternoon. I found her. She's alive and ready to tell everything. She wants to speak with you in person. Tomorrow. The drive to the town was made in tense silence. Laura stayed with a friend of Maria's, unaware of what was happening. Beatrice stared out the car window, her hands clasped in her lap, trembling slightly. Richard drove with a clenched jaw, his eyes fixed on the road. The house where Stella lived was simple, a modest building on a quiet street. Michael was waiting for them at the door. She's nervous, scared, but determined to talk. When Stella opened the door, Maria let out a choked cry and ran to hug her. The two sisters clung to each other, crying, 8 years of separation and pain exploding in that moment. Stella looked different, thinner, her hair shorter and dyed blonde, but she had the same kind eyes Richard remembered from the young nanny who had cared for his daughter with such affection. They sat in the small living room. Stella served coffee with trembling hands. Then, taking a deep breath, she began her story. That night, you and Mrs. Beatrice had gone out to dinner. I was taking care of the baby. She had just fallen asleep when I heard a noise downstairs. Thought it was Rosa or Tom, but when I went down to check, I saw 2 men I didn't know. Richard leaned forward. Who were they? One of them was Brian Miller, from the hospital. The other I didn't know at the time, but I later found out he was a private security guard hired by someone close to you. Stella wiped away tears. They had come to take the baby. Brian said it was an order, that the child needed to disappear because of inheritance issues, that there was a lot of money at stake. Beatrice brought a hand to her mouth. Inheritance? What inheritance? The family company, Stella explained. I heard Brian on the phone with someone. He said that with the child out of the way, he would finally have total control of the stock, that the plan was working perfectly. Richard felt his blood run cold. Someone from his own family, someone who would benefit if his daughter died. The list was short and terrible. I didn't let them, Stella continued, her voice firm despite the tears. I took the baby and ran out the back of the house, but they followed me. That's when they started the fire to cover up what they were doing. I managed to escape, but I couldn't go back. Brian called me the next day and said that if I showed up, if I told anyone anything, he would make sure I never saw my family again, and that he would make the baby disappear forever. Maria held her sister's hand. So you brought her to me? Stella nodded. It was the only solution I could think of. You were the only person I trusted completely. I gave you Laura and disappeared, hoping that over time they would forget, that she would be safe. But you never told me who her parents were, Maria murmured, because it was safer that way. If you didn't know, you couldn't tell if someone asked. I've carried this guilt for 8 years, knowing I separated a family, but also knowing I saved that child's life. Richard was pale. Brian Miller. You said he was talking to someone on the phone. Did you hear a name? Stella closed her eyes, trying to remember. He called the person Sir, and in one of the conversations he mentioned something about the partner will be pleased to know. It's resolved. Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The partner. At the time of the fire, he had only one partner in the company, Edward Taylor, his cousin, his mother's brother's son. A man who had always shown interest in taking control of the company, who had made several offers to buy Richard's shares over the years. A man who, after the fire, when Richard was too devastated to work, temporarily took over the management of the company and never fully gave it back. The revelation hit Richard like a bucket of ice water. Edward Taylor, his cousin, the man who had stood by his side at the funeral that should never have happened, the man who had put a hand on his shoulder and said he would be there for whatever he needed, the man who, for the past 8 years, had assumed increasing control over the family company, while Richard sank into grief and mechanical work. I need proof, Richard said, his voice trembling with contained rage. I need something concrete that links Edward to all of this. Michael was already a step ahead. I'll investigate the connection between Edward and Brian Miller. Financial, transactions, meetings, anything that connects them. But before they could act, the situation worsened drastically. The next morning, when Maria went to pick up Laura from school, the girl wasn't there. The principal, confused, said that a man had arrived earlier, introducing himself as the child's uncle, with documents that seemed to authorize him to pick her up. Maria felt her world collapse. She called Richard in a total panic. He and Beatrice dropped everything and rushed to the school. Michael was already mobilizing contacts, trying to track the car that had taken Laura. "It was Edward," Richard said, his hands shaking with fury and fear. "He found out we were investigating. He took Laura. Beatrice was on the verge of a breakdown. She had just discovered her daughter was alive, had rediscovered hope after 8 years of pain, and now the child had been taken again. It was a cruelty beyond any limit." Richard's phone rang. Blocked number. He answered with a pounding heart. "Richard," the voice was calm, almost gentle. "Edward, we need to talk about this whole situation you're creating. Where is Laura? What have you done with her? The girl is fine, safe, just making sure. You understand the gravity of what you're doing?" Edward paused. "You're digging up things that should have stayed in the past. Why can't you just accept what happened and move on?" "You stole my daughter!" Richard screamed, all his attempts at control crumbling. "You set that fire, forged documents, made me believe she was dead." "I saved the company," Edward replied, his voice still calm, but with a coldness that made Richard's blood freeze. "You were too weak to run it properly. The decisions you were making were driving the business into the ground. Someone had to act. So you decided to kill my daughter. The plan wasn't to kill her, just to remove her, to ensure I had the necessary control. But things got out of hand that night. The nanny ran off with the baby. We started the fire to cover it up, and then it was easier to maintain the lie than to correct it." Richard could hardly believe what he was hearing, the coldness, the complete lack of remorse. "You're going to pay for this." "No, cousin. You're going to back off. You're going to stop the investigation, get rid of that detective, and go back to your life. In return, the girl goes back to the cleaning lady. Everyone moves on." "And if I don't?" The silence that followed was heavy with threat. "Then the girl disappears for real, and this time there won't be a brave nanny to save her. You have 24 hours to decide." The call ended. Richard stood there, holding the phone, feeling a rage so intense he could barely think. Beatrice looked at him with desperate eyes. What did he say? What's going to happen to Laura? Richard hugged her, feeling his wife's body tremble. "We're going to get her back, I promise." Michael arrived half an hour later with news. "I tracked the car. Security cameras show it went to an estate in upstate New York. The property is registered to a shell corporation, but digging deeper, I found that Edward is one of the shareholders." "Then let's go there now," Richard said. "We can't just storm the place. If Laura is there, they could hurt her if they see us coming. We need a plan." It was the longest afternoon of Richard's life. Michael put together a careful strategy. He hired help, trusted people, ex-colleagues from his police. Days he still kept in touch with. They needed to get to the estate undetected, confirm Laura was there, and get her out safely. Meanwhile, Richard pretended to consider Edward's offer. He sent a message saying he needed time to think, that it was a difficult decision. Buying time was crucial. At night, the operation began. Michael and 2 contacts approached the estate through the woods, using the darkness as cover. Richard and Beatrice waited in a car far away. The phone vibrated. A text from Michael. "Confirmed, the girl is here, 2nd floor, 2 men on guard." Richard replied, "Can you get her out?" The response took long, agonizing minutes. "Working on it." Beatrice held Richard's hand so tightly it hurt. She prayed quietly, broken words pleading for Laura's safety. Another text. "Complication. They've detected our approach. We need to move now or abort." Richard didn't hesitate. Move. The next few minutes were a blur of pure anxiety. The phone went silent. No texts, no calls. Richard started calling Michael, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Then lights appeared on the road, a car coming at high speed. Richard tensed, preparing to flee if necessary. But when the vehicle pulled up beside them, it was Michael, and in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket, was Laura. Maria, who had insisted on coming despite everyone's protests, jumped out of the car before it had even fully stopped. She opened the back door and took Laura in her arms, crying uncontrollably. "Are you okay? Are you okay, my love?" Laura, frightened but unharmed, clung to the only mother she had ever known. "I was scared. Those men scared me." Beatrice got out of the car slowly, watching the scene. Seeing her daughter in another woman's arms being called Mom by a voice that wasn't hers was painful in a way she didn't know how to process, but it was also beautiful, because Maria loved Laura, genuinely, deeply, and Laura was safe because of that love. Michael explained quickly. "We got in while they were distracted by something. I grabbed the girl and we got out the back, but they'll realize soon we need to get out of here." They went to a discreet hotel in another town. Michael had contacts who secured rooms without a formal registration. They needed a safe place while they decided their next steps. Next morning, Edward called Richard. His voice was no longer calm, it was furious. "You made a huge mistake. You trespassed on private property, took a child. I'm going to sue you for kidnapping." "It wasn't kidnapping, it was a rescue, and you know it." "Proof, Richard. Do you have proof of what you're saying? Because I have witnesses who will swear you broke into that estate and took a girl by force." Richard took a deep breath. "I have Stella, the nanny. She'll testify to everything. And I have evidence that you paid Brian Miller to Alter Hospital. Records." There was a silence. When Edward spoke again, his voice had a dangerous quality. "Stella is willing to testify, even knowing she could implicate herself, that she could lose everything?" "She's willing to do what's right. We'll see." The call ended. In the hours that followed, things happened that showed just how desperate Edward was. He tried to access Richard's bank accounts and found that he had moved all his assets for legal protection. He tried to call an emergency board meeting to oust Richard and discovered that several board members were on Richard's side, tired of Edward's suspicious maneuvers. But the cruelest move came when Edward filed a formal complaint of neglect against Maria, arguing that she had raised a child without a legal adoption, that Laura should be placed in state custody while her true identity was investigated. It was a calculated blow to separate Laura from everyone who loved her. Maria was devastated. Beatrice was in despair. Richard felt a rage so deep he had to walk away to keep from doing something he would regret. "He's using the system against us," Michael said, "manipulating the laws to get what he wants. We need something definitive to stop him." The answer came from where they least expected it. Renee, the nurse who had contacted Maria, called again. "I found something. Old hospital documents that show irregular payments made by Edward to Brian Miller around the time of the birth. I got them because I have a friend in the finance department who kept old copies before an audit. But when they went to get the documents, they found Renee's apartment had been broken into. Everything was ransacked, the documents gone. And Renee was in the hospital injured, saying she had been attacked on her way home. Edward was eliminating evidence, and he didn't care who he hurt in the process. The news that Renee was in the hospital changed everything. It was no longer just a business dispute or a custody issue. Edward had crossed a dangerous line by physically attacking someone. But when Richard tried to convince Renee to press charges, she refused, terrified. He said if I talked, my mother would suffer the consequences. She's in a nursing home, vulnerable. I can't risk it, Renee cried, holding Maria's hand. I'm sorry, I wanted to help, but I can't. Richard understood. Fear was a very effective prison. Edward knew it and used it without scruples, but there was one other person who could testify, Brian Miller. The man who had executed the plan, altered the documents, started the fire. If they could get him to talk, they would have everything they needed. Michael located Brian at his company, a sleek office in a downtown high-rise. The man was living well off the money Edward had paid him for his silence. The approach had to be careful. Michael suggested, "Let me talk to him first. Sometimes it's easier to confess to a stranger." Richard agreed, though. Every fiber of his being screamed to take justice into his own hands. Michael met Brian at a coffee shop. The man arrived arrogant in an expensive suit. But when Michael mentioned names, dates, transferred amounts, the facade cracked. "I don't know what you're talking about," Brian said, but his voice trembled slightly. "Brian, I know exactly what happened 8 years ago. I know you altered hospital records, that you were paid for it, that you helped orchestrate a fire. I know everything." Michael leaned forward. "The question isn't if I'm going to prove it. It's when. And when that happens, you're going to answer for all of it." Brian turned pale. "Edward said it was all taken care of, that no one would ever find out." "Edward lied. To you, and to a lot of people. And now he's trying to eliminate all the evidence, including witnesses." Michael paused. "A nurse was assaulted yesterday, did you know?" Brian's eyes widened. "No, I didn't know. I had nothing to do with that. But you paved the way for it to happen. You're an accomplice to everything Edward has done and is doing." Michael placed a card on the table. "Here's my number. When you decide to do the right thing, call me. Testify against Edward. Help fix the mistake you made. Or wait to be dragged down with him when it all falls apart." Brian stared at the card, his hands shaking. Michael stood up and left, leaving him alone with his conscience. 2 days later, Michael's phone rang. It was Brian. "I want to make a deal. I'll tell you everything, but I need protection. Edward is dangerous." Brian's confession was recorded, documented, and witnessed by lawyers. He told them everything. How Edward had approached him months before Richard's baby was born, offering money to alter records as soon as the child arrived. How the plan was to make the baby disappear in a way that seemed accidental. How Stella discovered it and fled with the child, forcing them to improvise the fire to cover up the disappearance. Edward was desperate, Brian explained. He had huge gambling debts. He needed control of the company to renegotiate, to use assets as collateral. Richard's daughter was the only obstacle to him having enough shares to make unilateral decisions. Richard listened to the recording with a clenched fist. To discover that his daughter had been torn from him over gambling debts was sickening. The coldness, the cruelty of it all was beyond comprehension. With Brian's confession in hand, Richard sought out specialized lawyers. They built a solid case: document fraud, attempted embezzlement, threats, assault. Every crime meticulously documented. But when they tried to deliver the documentation to the proper authorities, they discovered that Edward had more resources than they imagined. He had hired one of the most expensive and influential law firms in New York City. They began to contest every piece of evidence, to question the validity of Brian's confession, to suggest it was all a setup by Richard to seize total control of the company. The legal battle dragged on for weeks. Meanwhile, Laura remained in a delicate situation. Maria was afraid to leave the house with her. Beatrice spent hours watching from a distance, wanting to be close but not knowing how to approach without scaring the girl. Richard worked tirelessly with the lawyers, sleeping little, eating poorly, consumed by the need for justice. It was Beatrice who finally said what they were all thinking but were afraid to admit. "What if we can't win? What if Edward gets away with all of this?" The question echoed in the empty room of the house. Richard had no answer. For the first time in this whole journey, he felt the crushing weight of the possibility of failure. But then something unexpected happened. Edward made a mistake. In an attempt to strengthen his case, he called a press conference where he presented himself as the victim of a family conspiracy. He talked about how Richard had been mentally unstable since the fire, how he was making up stories, trying to blame others for his own negligence. It was a calculated but fatal error, because by speaking publicly, by making specific accusations, Edward opened a legal precedent, and worse, he drew media attention to the case. Journalists began to investigate on their own, to ask questions, to unearth inconsistencies. A particularly persistent investigative reporter named Chloe Anderson delved into the hospital records. She discovered that other families had complained of irregularities around the same time. Nothing as serious as Richard's case, but small inconsistencies in birth records, documents that had mysteriously disappeared. Chloe published an explosive story questioning the integrity of the hospital system at the time and mentioning Richard's case as a possible example of systematic corruption. The story went viral. Other journalists picked up the theme. Edward, who thought he was controlling the narrative, saw it slip from his grasp. Pressured by the public exposure, the growing pile of evidence, and Brian's detailed confession, Edward finally began to feel the ground give way beneath his feet. His lawyers suggested a settlement. He would return all the misappropriated company shares, pay a substantial settlement, and in return would not face a full criminal trial. Richard refused. "I don't want a settlement. I want justice." His lawyers advised him to reconsider. Criminal. Trials were long, expensive, and uncertain. A settlement would at least guarantee some restitution. But Beatrice surprised everyone. "This isn't about money or the company. It's about our daughter, about the 8 years they stole from us, about Laura growing up knowing that the man who did this to her paid for his crime." Beatrice's determination strengthened Richard. They would move forward, no matter how long it took. While the legal battle intensified, something more delicate was happening in parallel. Laura, shielded from many details but aware that something big was going on, began to ask Maria questions. "Why does that lady keep looking at me from far away?" she asked one day, referring to Beatrice. Maria swallowed hard. The time had come to start telling the truth, in small doses that a 7-year-old could process. "Remember I told you that you came to live with me when you were a baby? That my sister brought you?" Laura nodded. "That lady and the man with her are very important people in your story, people who have loved you for a very long time." "Are they my parents?" Tears filled Maria's eyes. "Biologically, yes. But I love you, like a daughter too, and I will never stop loving you." Laura grew thoughtful. "Can I have more than one mum?" The question, asked with the pure simplicity of childhood, broke Maria's heart in a beautiful way. "Yes, my love, you can." In the following days, careful meetings were arranged between Laura, Beatrice, and Richard, always with Maria present, always respecting the child's pace. Beatrice brought small gifts, not to buy affection, but to show she cared. Richard told stories about the family, showed old photos, built gentle bridges between the past and the present. Laura was curious but cautious. She asked questions, observed, processed. There were moments when she would get close to Beatrice, touch her hair, compare her own small hands with her biological mother's. "We look alike," she would say with delight. But she always went back to Maria, always checked to see if she was still there. The 8-year bond would not be erased, nor should it be. And slowly, everyone was learning that love was not a zero-sum game, that there was room for all of these connections to exist. It was during one of these meetings that the news arrived. Edward's lawyers contacted them with a new request. He wanted to testify in person, to make a full statement. Something in him had broken. The room where Edward gave his testimony was small and claustrophobic, with grey walls and a metal table in the center. Richard and Beatrice sat on one side, accompanied by their lawyers. On the other, Edward, visibly aged since they had last seen him, was accompanied by his own legal team. The man who once exuded confidence and arrogance now looked broken. Deep, dark circles marked his face. His hands trembled slightly on the table. "I'm going to tell you everything," Edward began, his voice hoarse. "Not because I expect forgiveness, I know I don't deserve it, but because I can't carry this anymore." And then, for 3 exhausting hours, Edward detailed every step of the plan. How the idea came to him when he discovered his gambling debts had reached an unsustainable point. How dangerous people began to threaten him, demanding payment. How he looked at the company's shareholder structure and realized that if Richard's daughter didn't exist, he would have enough control to use the company as collateral, renegotiate his debts and save himself. "I thought it would be simple," he said, wiping away tears that fell uncontrollably. "Just make the baby disappear. Give her up for adoption in another state. Forge documents. No one would get hurt." "But you did hurt people," Beatrice said, her voice as sharp as glass. "You destroyed 8 years of our lives. You deprived Laura of knowing her real parents. You deprived us of watching our daughter grow up." Edward lowered his head. "I know. When Stella ran off with the baby, I panicked. Brian suggested the fire to cover up the disappearance. I agreed. I was so desperate, so scared that I agreed to something monstrous." "And after?" Richard asked. "After you got what you wanted?" "I kept sinking. The debts were paid, but the weight of what I had done was unbearable. I started drinking. avoiding family, friends. Every time I saw you, Richard, carrying that grief, that pain, I died a little inside. But it wasn't enough to make you confess, Richard said coldly. No, because confessing would mean losing everything. And I'm a coward. Edward looked directly at Richard. I'm a coward who destroyed his family for money and then didn't have the courage to fix his mistake. Our confession was recorded, authenticated, and witnessed. It was the last piece of the puzzle. With it, the case against Edward became irrefutable. In the following weeks, Edward's situation completely fell apart. Company shareholders, horrified by the revelations, demanded his immediate resignation. Contracts were cancelled. His reputation, once respectable in business circles, was destroyed. But for Richard and Beatrice, the legal victory was only part of a much more complex journey, because now they had to figure out how to build a life with Laura, how to integrate this 7-year-old child who knew other parents, other stories, into their reality. The sessions with the child psychologist were revealing and painful. Dr. Patricia Morgan, a specialist in adoption and family reunification cases, explained that Laura needed time, stability, and above all, the certainty that she would not lose Maria. She sees Maria as her mother, Dr. Morgan explained. That bond cannot be abruptly broken. You need to build a relationship of coexistence, not replacement. It was decided that Laura would continue to live with Maria, but with increasing visits from Richard and Beatrice. They started with afternoons in the park, then dinners together, eventually weekends. Every step was measured, careful, always respecting the girl's pace. There were moments of unexpected beauty, like when Laura, after a month of regular visits, spontaneously took Beatrice's hand as they walked through the zoo, or when she asked Richard to read her a story before bed, something Maria always did, but that could now be shared. But there were also difficult moments. Night terrors, where Laura would wake up scared, wanting only Maria. Refusals to go to certain places, afraid that if she left with Richard and Beatrice, she wouldn't come home. Confusion about who was who in her life. Maria, for her part, faced her own demons, the constant fear of losing Laura, even though she rationally knew the biological parents didn't want to take her away. Involuntary jealousy when she saw Laura getting close to Beatrice. Guilt for having raised the girl without knowing the full truth. It was Stella who suggested something radical. What if we all lived together, at least temporarily, so Laura can have all of us present, without this confusing fragmentation? The idea was unconventional, but something about it made sense. After many conversations, therapy sessions, and careful planning, they decided to try it. Richard and Beatrice had that huge, empty mansion. There was more than enough space. Maria and Laura moved into a wing of the house. It had its own bedrooms and living room, preserving some autonomy. But they shared meals with Richard and Beatrice, shared common spaces, and created a non-traditional but functional family. The first few months were a constant adjustment, establishing routines, respecting boundaries, learning to live together. Beatrice had to accept that she couldn't just take over the maternal role she had lost, that she needed to earn that space gradually, sharing it with Maria. Richard, accustomed to controlling his professional life with an iron fist, had to learn to be patient, to let things flow, to accept that some issues had no immediate solution. But Laura flourished, having all these people who loved her under the same roof, without having to choose, without feeling that betraying one was disrespecting another, gave her a security she had never experienced. She began to open up more, to smile more often, to make plans for the future with the confidence of someone who knows they have a solid foundation. It was on a Sunday afternoon, 6 months after the move, that a defining moment occurred. Laura was drawing in the living room, concentrating. Beatrice came in and sat beside her, watching. The drawing showed a large house with many windows. Outside, there were 5 figures: a woman with her hair up, Beatrice, a tall man with glasses, Richard, 2 shorter women who looked alike, Maria and Stella, and a small girl, Laura. "It's my family," Laura explained, still drawing. "All of it." Tears filled Beatrice's eyes. "It's beautiful." Maria said, "I'm lucky." That I have more people loving me than most kids. Laura looked at Beatrice. Is that true? It is, my love. You are so loved. Laura hesitated, then asked something that had clearly been bothering her for a while. Can I call you Mom, Beatrice? And keep calling Maria just Mom? Beatrice's heart broke and healed at the same time. You can call me whatever you feel comfortable with, Laura. There's no wrong way. But I want a way that's special. Just mine, Laura thought. Can I call you Mama B? Beatrice could barely answer through her tears. Yes, you can. That small negotiation, made with the simple wisdom of a child trying to organize her world, represented a turning point. Laura was creating her own language to name her affections, finding different words for different but equally valid loves. Meanwhile, the legal case against Edward reached its final conclusions. He would be sentenced to return all the misappropriated funds, pay a substantial settlement, and perform community service. There would be no prison time, given that he had confessed and fully cooperated, but his life as he knew it was over. Brian Miller also faced consequences, though lesser ones for having cooperated from the beginning. He lost his company, his reputation, but avoided a major criminal conviction for providing crucial evidence. Richard took back full control of the company, but something had changed in him. Work, which had once been an escape and an obsession, was now just work. His priorities had shifted. He delegated more, hired competent executives, and started leaving the office before 6 in the afternoon. Because now he had something to come home to. Noisy dinners where Laura told them about her day at school, where Maria and Beatrice cooked together creating strange but laughter-filled recipes, where Stella played the guitar and everyone sang old songs off-key but happy. It was a strange, patched-together family, built from broken pieces, that were carefully glued back together. But it was theirs, and it was real. One evening, with Laura already asleep, the 4 adults sat in the garden. The sky was clear, stars shining faintly through New York's light pollution. Do you think she's going to be okay? Maria asked, the worry still present in her voice. She's going to be more than okay, Beatrice replied, because she has us, all of us. Richard poured wine, and they made a toast, not to the tragedy that had brought them together, but to the unlikely family they had built from it. The first year of the new family arrangement brought challenges no one had fully anticipated. There were moments of genuine harmony, but also inevitable conflicts when people with such different histories tried to build something together. Maria had a hard time delegating decisions about Laura. When Beatrice suggested moving Laura to a private school with more resources, Maria felt attacked, as if they were saying she hadn't taken good care of the girl. The argument that followed was intense and painful. It's not about you failing, Beatrice tried to explain, her hands shaking. It's about giving her opportunities she might not have had before. She was happy at her school, she had friends. Why change everything again? Richard intervened. Maybe we can ask Laura what she wants. It was a simple but revolutionary solution, to stop deciding for Laura and start including her in the decisions about her own life. When they asked, Laura thought carefully and said she would like to try the new school, but only if she could still see her old friends on weekends. Compromise, negotiation, respect. These words became the pillars of their family. Stella found her place. She had a talent for gardening and transformed the mansion's gardens into a vibrant space. Laura loved helping her, learning about plants. Aunt Stella, Laura said one day, getting her hands dirty, you saved my life when I was a baby. Stella stopped digging, surprised. Who told you that? Mama B. She said you were very brave, that you risked everything to protect me. Tears filled Stella's eyes. I just did what any decent person would do. But not everyone is decent, Laura replied with the raw wisdom of childhood. That man who tried to hurt me wasn't. Edward, even after all this time, his shadow still loomed over them. Laura knew of his existence, knew vaguely what he had done, but had been spared the cruelest details. Still, she understood that she had been the target of a malice she didn't deserve. Are you angry at him? Stella asked, curious about how Laura processed it all. Laura thought, a little, but mostly I feel sorry for him, because he lost a real family just to have money. And money can't hug you when you have a nightmare. The profound simplicity of the observation left Stella speechless. Laura was right. Edward had traded love for power and was left with neither. Months passed. The routine settled in. Laura thrived at the new school, keeping old friendships and making new ones. Richard rediscovered the joy of being a father, attending parent-teacher conferences, helping with homework, taking Laura to the park. Beatrice, for her part, found in Laura a second chance she never thought she would have. She taught the girl to cook, shared stories from her own childhood, and created new traditions. Every Saturday morning they made pancakes together, a ritual just for them. Maria, after the initial adjustment period, started studying. Richard offered to pay for college, something she had never been able to do before. She chose education, wanting to work with children, to help others who might be in situations similar to what Laura had gone through. "You don't have to do this," Richard said, when Maria thanked him for the opportunity. "I know I don't have to, but I want to. I spent years cleaning houses, and there's no shame in that, but I always dreamed of doing more." "Then do it," Richard smiled. "I'll be here to support you." The dynamic between Beatrice and Maria also evolved. Initially tense, silently competing for Laura's affection, they gradually realized they weren't rivals. They were allies in the mission of raising an incredible girl. They began to talk more, share concerns, ask each other for advice. Beatrice, who came from a world of privilege, learned from Maria's practical wisdom about resilience and contentment. Maria, who had struggled her whole life, learned from Beatrice about setting boundaries and demanding respect. It was on a rainy afternoon, when Laura was at school and the men were at work, that Beatrice and Maria had a conversation that would change everything. "Are you afraid I'll take her away?" Beatrice asked directly. Maria hesitated. "Sometimes, not rationally. I know you wouldn't do that, but deep down there's a fear I can't shake." "I'm scared too," Beatrice confessed. "Scared I'll never be to her what you are, that no matter how hard I try, I'll always be the mother she met too late." "It's not a competition," Maria said softly. "I know, but I can't help but compare," Maria thought. "Laura told me that when she's sad at school, she thinks of two things: Saturday pancakes with you and the hugs I give her before bed. She doesn't choose, she needs both." Beatrice smiled through her tears. "We're lucky, aren't we, to have her?" "We are, and she's lucky to have us." In that moment, something solidified between them. It wasn't exactly friendship, though it was heading that way. It was a deep understanding that they were two women who loved the same child, and that this love, multiplied, not divided, only made Laura stronger. Meanwhile, changes were also happening in the outside world. The family's story had become known through the media coverage of Edward's trial. Journalists, always in search of touching narratives, turned the case into an example of a modern family. But not all the attention was positive. There were judgments, people questioning whether it was right for Laura to live with so many adults, whether there wouldn't be confusion, whether it wouldn't be better to choose a real family. Laura, exposed to some of these comments through parents of classmates at school, came home one day visibly upset. "A mom at school said my family is weird," she said during dinner, poking at her food with her fork. The silence that followed was heavy. Richard was the first to speak. "And what do you think?" Laura thought. "I think she doesn't get it, that a family doesn't have to be like the ones in books. It can be whatever way works for the people in it." "Exactly," Beatrice agreed. "And does our family work for you?" "It works," Laura smiled. "Even when you guys fight about silly stuff, it works." Her honesty made them laugh. Yes, they fought sometimes over little things, whether Laura should have more or less screen time, if she could have dessert before dinner, who was going to pick her up from school. But they were normal conflicts, healthy even, signs that everyone cared enough to have an opinion. 2 years after the initial reunification, something no one expected happened. Edward asked to see Laura. He had no legal right, no longer had any recognized family connection, but through his lawyers he made the request. Richard rejected it immediately. No way, he doesn't even deserve to breathe the same air as her. But Beatrice surprised everyone by saying, "Maybe we should let Laura decide." "She's 9 years old," Richard protested, "and she's smart enough to have an opinion about who comes into her life." They consulted the psychologist. Dr. Morgan was cautious, but agreed that, with proper preparation, Laura could be included in the decision. When they asked her, Laura was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "I want to ask him one thing, just one thing, and then I'll decide." They arranged an extremely controlled meeting. In a neutral office with the psychologist present, with Richard and Beatrice waiting in the next room, Laura came face to face with Edward. The man who had tried to destroy her family was unrecognizable. Graying hair, simple clothes, a stooped posture. He looked at Laura with a mixture of shame and something that might have been genuine remorse. "Hi, Laura. Hi. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. Really sorry. For what I did." Laura studied him with those almond-shaped eyes she had inherited from Beatrice. "My question is, if you could go back in time, would you do it differently?" Edward didn't hesitate. "Yes, not because I'm afraid of the consequences, but because I destroyed lives, including my own, for greed. And that's a lesson I learned too late." Laura nodded. "Okay, thanks for answering." "Do you forgive me?" the girl thought. "I don't know yet, but I don't want to be angry forever either, so maybe one day." It was the shortest possible meeting, but a significant one. Laura decided she didn't want to see him again, at least not in the near future. But she also decided she didn't want to carry hatred. She just wanted to move on. When she told her family her decision, they all supported her. Richard, who had initially opposed it, realized that Laura had an emotional maturity that many adults never achieve. She was choosing peace over revenge, growth over resentment. "You're amazing, you know that?" Beatrice said, hugging Laura. "I learned from you." "Guys," the girl replied simply. "You could have hated Maria and Stella for hiding me, but you chose to love, so I'm choosing too." The lawyer's office seemed smaller than it was, suffocated by the tension that filled every corner. Richard sat to the right of the mahogany desk, Beatrice beside him, their hands clasped tightly. On the other side, Edward Taylor adjusted his Italian silk tie with fingers that trembled slightly. At 63, Richard's former partner and cousin maintained an erect posture, but there was sweat on his brow. Between them, piles of documents, recordings, and reports formed a mountain of truths that could no longer be hidden. Richard's lawyer, Mr. Davis, placed the last document on the table. It was a handwritten confession, signed by a former security guard from the mansion who now lived in a nursing home in Queens. The man, consumed by guilt and the fear of passing without clearing his conscience, had reported everything: how Edward had approached him weeks before the fire, how they had planned every detail, how an abandoned child was used to simulate the couple's irreparable loss. "Mr. Taylor," Mr. Davis's voice was firm but restrained, "the documents here prove that you altered hospital records, embezzled inheritance funds, and orchestrated the disappearance of a child. We have recordings, testimonies, and forensic reports that connect every dot." Edward didn't answer immediately. He looked at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. Richard watched the man he had once called a mentor, a friend, almost a father. The anger he felt was so deep it hurt physically, but there was something else, an overwhelming sadness at the realization that greed had destroyed not only his family, but also the soul of the man before him. "Why?" Beatrice's voice came, out broken but firm. "We trusted you. You were her godfather. How could you do that to a helpless child?" Edward finally raised his eyes. They were red, sunken, carrying the weight of 8 years of lies. "The company was on the verge of bankruptcy because of bad investments I made to cover my gambling debts. I needed immediate capital. The Children's Trust Fund was the only way out." His voice was hoarse. "I thought it would be simple. One less child, less division of assets, more money available. I didn't think—" "You didn't think that child had a life ahead of her?" Richard interrupted, the words like blades. "You didn't think you were destroying our family? You didn't think about my wife, who spent 8 years believing she had lost our daughter?" Edward lowered his head. There was no possible defense, no justification that could wash away what he had done. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with everything that could not be undone. Mr. Davis broke the silence. There is still the matter of the fire. Recent forensic analysis shows the fire was deliberately set to destroy evidence, and the medical reports for Richard's wife point to improper medication administered postpartum. For the first time, Edward looked genuinely shocked. No, not that, The fire was to cover up the swap, yes, but the medication... He looked at Richard with desperation. That was a hospital error, I swear. I never wanted your wife, that was a genuine accident. Richard didn't know if he believed him. He might never know the full truth of that night. But what mattered now was protecting Laura, ensuring she could grow up knowing who she was, where she came from, without the weight of poisonous secrets. The authorities have already been notified, Mr. Davis said. You have two options. Turn yourself in voluntarily or wait for them to come for you. Either way, there are consequences for your actions. Edward nodded slowly, as if finally accepting the inevitable. He stood, staggering, and for the first time looked directly at Richard. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I deserve everything that's coming. But tell Laura I'm sorry. Tell her she deserves so much better than this. Richard didn't reply. He simply watched the man leave the room, hunched, defeated, carrying the weight of choices that had ruined lives. When the door closed, Beatrice collapsed into Richard's arms, sobbing. They weren't tears of pain, but of relief. The truth, however painful, was better than the uncertainty that had consumed them for years. The following days were filled with hearings and testimonies. Maria was interviewed by social workers. Her unwitting participation was recognized. She had protected a child when Stella, terrified, had begged for help. The decision about Laura's custody was the hardest part. Richard and Beatrice had all the legal rights, all the financial support, all the documentation proving Laura was biologically their daughter. But there was something that weighed more than any piece of paper: Maria's love for the girl. It was Laura who, in a way, decided. Sitting between Beatrice and Maria in the mansion's living room, the 7-year-old girl looked at the two women who loved her. Her brown eyes, so much like Beatrice's, filled with tears. "Can I have two mums?" she asked in her small voice. Beatrice and Maria looked at each other, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Two women from completely different worlds, united only by their love for a child, understood that family was not defined by blood or by papers, but by choice and dedication. "Yes," Beatrice replied, reaching her hand out to Maria. "You can, and you will." In the following months, Laura moved into the mansion but visited Maria 3 times a week. They shared dinners and outings. Beatrice learned Laura's habits from Maria. Maria learned from Beatrice how to give the girl new opportunities. Richard discovered fatherhood late, but with intensity. He took Laura to school, helped with her homework. He turned a room into her own space, letting her choose every detail. The company was restructured. Richard created a foundation for missing children. He named it after the unknown child, who had been used to fake Laura's death. The foundation's headquarters opened in Midtown Manhattan. Laura was there, wearing the butterfly necklace. She didn't give a speech, but her presence represented everything the foundation stood for. Stella was never found. Maria held out hope of seeing her again. In the meantime, she honored Stella by caring for the niece she had saved. On a Sunday afternoon, almost a year after the reunion at the cemetery, the assembled family visited the mausoleum where it had all begun. Richard, Beatrice, Laura, and Maria stood before the light, marble but now with a different understanding. Their daughter wasn't there, but an unknown child who deserved to be remembered was. Laura placed fresh flowers in the bronze vase, the same gesture Beatrice had made for years. But now the gesture had a new meaning: gratitude, memory, an acknowledgement that her life had been preserved thanks to a terrible swap, but that she would honor the child who had lost everything. "Do you think she would have liked the foundation?" Laura asked quietly, looking at the plaque on the mausoleum. Beatrice knelt beside her daughter, putting an arm around her small shoulders. "I think so. I think she would be happy to know that her story, as sad as it is helping other children." Richard watched the scene with a tightness in his chest. He had lost 8 years with his daughter, but he had her back. He had discovered unimaginable betrayals, but had also found unexpected kindness in Maria. He had faced the worst possible truth, but from it, something new and precious had been born. As they left the cemetery, the sun was setting over New York City. The giant city roared around them, indifferent to the small tragedies and triumphs of their individual lives. But for those 4 people walking together toward the parking lot, the world had been rebuilt. Laura held Beatrice's hand with one hand, and Maria's with the other. Richard walked beside them, watching his daughter with a mixture of love, wonder, and profound gratitude. She was living proof that not all the hate, not all the greed, not all the lies in the world could completely erase the truth. And the truth was simple. She was alive, she was loved, she was finally home. That night in the mansion on the Upper East Side, Richard found Beatrice in Laura's room watching their daughter sleep. The girl breathed softly, hugging a teddy bear Maria had given her years ago. The butterfly necklace rested on the nightstand, reflecting the soft light of the lamp. "It was worth it," Beatrice whispered, without taking her eyes off Laura. "All the suffering, all the pain, all the searching. It was worth it to get here." Richard hugged his wife from behind, resting his chin on the top of her head. Yes, it was worth it. And in that quiet room, lit only by the golden glow of the lamp, 3 lives that had been shattered began at last to become whole again. They were not the same people they were before the tragedy. They carried scars, painful memories, questions without complete answers, but they had something that 8 years of grief had not managed to destroy: hope and love. A love that had survived fire, lies, time, and distance. A love that, like the butterfly on Laura's necklace, had been reborn from the ashes to fly again.